So welcome everyone to the program. My name is Mdu In, and today I am so excited. I've been looking forward to this interview for a very long time. Today I'm speaking to Anton Harber, the iconic, legendary journalist, South African journalist, Anton Harber. So it's a thrill for me today. So just to tell you a little bit about Anton Harber, for those few of you who may not know who he is. So Anton Harber was the founding co-editor of the Weekly Mail, which of course today is known as the Mail and Guardian. He was the chair of the Conference of Editors in 1991, the National Association of Broadcasters in 1998, and the Freedom of Expression Institute in 2010. He serves on the board of directors of the Global Investigative Journalism Network and the Center for Collaborative Investigative Journalism. He is an adjunct professor of journalism at the University of Witwatersrand, WITS, and a columnist for Business Day. And he has co-edited several books, but he is the author of Deep Slut, which was published in 2011. And also he is the author of this newly published book, which was published this year, So for the Record, Behind the Headlines in an Era of State Capture. So I'm very excited to be speaking to him about this latest release. And before I let Anton speak, let me just tell you a little bit about what this book is about. So a very complimentary critique from Jacob Dlamini, which you'll also find at the back of the book. He says, only Anton Harber, a pioneer of independent journalism in South Africa and one of the keenest observers of the media around, could have written the thriller that is this book. And then the book, it carries on saying, veteran journalist Anton Harber brings all his investigative skills to bear on his very own profession, the media. For 2 years, he conducted dozens of interviews with politicians, journalists, policemen, state security agents, and deep throats before piecing together two remarkable tales. The first is a chilling story of police death squads, rogue units, and renditions, and how South Africa's biggest newspaper was duped into doing the dirty work of corrupt politicians. The second starts with a broken and discarded hard drive and evolves with many near misses into the exposure of the depths of the Gupta's influence over the ruling party. Harber's two tales reveal the lows and highs of journalism during an era of state capture. His book is both a disquieting expose of how easily the media can be duped by conniving cabal for its own selfish ends, and a celebration of brilliant investigative reports by brave and ethical journalists. Anton Harber, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those kind words. When you call me a veteran, you know, I've been in this is my 40th year in journalism, which I think means that I'm just beginning to find out how to do it. I'm just finding my feet. In the
so it gets better. So as you gain more experience, you learn more. You learn how to do it better.
I should hope so.
Yes, and I think it's the same thing with most professions. As you do the work, you learn more about the work and how to perfect it better and better.
But you're learning all the time, and particularly in journalism, because unless you're learning and you're curious and you're learning new ways to do things all the time in journalism, you very quickly fall behind and lose it.
Yes, and especially since times are changing and the media outputs are changing, so you also have to adapt with the times.
No question. Journalism in particular has changed so much every year that one has to relearn. But let me say this, one relearns new tools, one relearns new digital tools, one relearns new approaches, but the fundamentals of finding the facts and verifying and checking and trying to write it in a way that's interesting, the fundamentals remain the same.
Mm. Mm. Yes, I would hope so. I should hope so. The truth, and I'll ask you a question about this during our conversation, about the difference or the correlation between facts and truth, and the process of acquiring the facts and reporting the truth, and the process of that. I'll ask you that question a little bit later on. But I just want to find out, so you've titled this book, So for the Record, behind the headlines in an era of state capture. What inspired this title, and also what inspired this book?
Well, let me start with what inspired the book. I found myself caught in, as a media observer, commentator, and journalism professor, I found myself caught in the discussion about the state of South African media and South African news media and journalism in particular through this very difficult time. And it's a time which has seen, as I describe in the book, some great, world-class, impactful, important public service journalism of the best kind, but also some of the worst journalism this country has ever seen. And so I found I needed to ask myself, why did this happen? Why did we see the best and the worst together? Particularly, what led to the worst? What was it at our biggest newspaper, in particular, the Sunday Times, that set it down in a path where it got so much wrong and did so much damage, and lost so much trust and faith? Why did that happen? Because I was hoping two things. I was hoping, first of all, that it would be a lesson to us all about both the importance of and the value of journalism and the limitations and problems of journalism. And it would provide for the ordinary reader some insight into how journalism and the media works, particularly at this time, because I think we all need a much better understanding of how the media works and what journalists can or cannot do. As to the title of the book, So for the Record, well, I suppose it picks up on something of a journalistic cliche, indicating we want to get some things down just to make sure they're on the record. A quote I use in the book is, of course, the famous one that says, news journalism is often the first draft of history. So a lot of it is about getting the basic facts down to put on the record. And the book is really about the dispute over the facts, the truth, how we get to them, what happens when we fail to get to them.
And especially at this time of our country, and this term state capture, I think even people who don't understand the English language, who can't speak English, they can say state capture because it's been on the news for such a long time. But is state capture a new phenomenon in South Africa? And also, is media capture a new phenomenon in South Africa?
The short answer is no. Our state there's always been special interests that have had undue influence over the state, which you could call state capture. So, for example, you could well say that the Afrikaner Broederbond had state capture under the apartheid era. And mining capital has often had undue influence over our state, informing policy and allowing, for example, for migrant labor in this country. But it took a particular form and nature in the state capture, the recent period, I suppose, which is defined by Jacob Zuma's presidency. When you saw special interests getting and having got a direct hold on state institutions and on SOEs, state-owned enterprises, to an extraordinary extent, and were close to getting hold of the Treasury and the Reserve Bank, and which would have completed this form of state capture. So it was an extreme and direct and blatant state capture like we have never seen before. As to the media is always being pulled by special interests in one direction or another. And certainly large parts of our media have long been captured in one form or another. Under apartheid, broadcast media was all captured by the apartheid state, and certainly the Afrikaans media was captured by the National Party, the ruling party, and the English media. I think you could argue that a lot of the English media, if not all, most of it or all of it, was captured, in fact, by the mining industry. So media is always a place of, like the state, is always a place of contestation of who has control and influence. But the concern comes when that influence becomes too great, overrides other influences, and you start seeing these institutions used for personal, political, corrupt gain, rather than their fundamental purpose, which is to serve the public interest.
But surely, since journalists need sources, and if the source is within a government department, does that not leave the journalist vulnerable to being fed incorrect information or information with an agenda? Because the journalist needs the source?
There's no question. In an ideal situation, the source and the journalist need each other, and they therefore have to trust each other, and there's a balance of power between them. What has happened with the rise of social media and other media is that the source has become more powerful than the journalist and opened the situation to much more manipulation. I think what my book tries to show and argue is that journalists have to develop a new and much keener vigilance about double-checking, verifying, checking the facts, ascertaining as close as they can to the truth, and accepting. A fundamental thing is to accept there isn't one story. There isn't one truth. There are multiple competing viewpoints of the truth. And as journalists, we don't just take all of those in. We have to verify them. We have to weigh them up. We have to decide. We make critical decisions about how much weight and importance and value to place on different narratives, different versions. But that's our job. What the book shows, I think, is that we've had to learn to be much more vigilant about accepting competing and complicated narratives.
And so on that note, there are three main stories. You talk about some stories, but there are three main stories in the book that you critique, that you talk about, from the Sunday Times. So the one story involves Johan Boysen, who was the Hawks head in KZN. And then this was the December 11 story that was written and pursued by Mzilikazi wa Afrika and Stefan Hofstadter about the Cato Manor Police Death Squad. And then the second story is the October 11 case involving Anwar Dramat, who was the national head of the Hawks until 2015, and Shadrach Sibiya was the former Gauteng Hawks boss until also 2015. And now this case involved the rendition accusations involving Zimbabwean criminals being handed over to Zimbabwean authorities at the border. And then the other story that I want us to talk about later on that you mentioned is the August 2014 story involving Johan van Logenberg. And of course, this involves SARS and the illicit tobacco industry. So out of all the stories, why did you choose these three stories? Was it maybe to illustrate the pitfalls that journalists face when dealing with difficult stories, such as these stories were difficult, especially within fast journalism? Or was it to set the record straight about these individuals that were implicated?
So these were 3 stories that the Sunday Times did in this period, that in 2017, 2018, they apologized for them all, they withdrew them all, and they parted ways with some of the journalists involved. So they presented themselves to me as very interesting examples of where they had gone wrong. And I had a particular interest because I had sat on judging panels that gave major awards to the first of these stories. So clearly, I, in a sense, also had to account for that. I wanted to get the record straight on these stories, but I thought that if I take a deep dive into how they did the story and where it went wrong, then people would come to understand how journalism works. That's what I really wanted to do, is take people inside the newsroom, inside the work of journalists, to understand the nature of the work. It's complicated, it's difficult, it's risky, it's fraught with dangers and mistakes. And so what happened here, and most of all, why did the Sunday Times in particular stick with these stories month after month when it became clear that their stories were being strongly disputed and were on weak grounds? So I do something that's quite unusual, is I look in great detail as to how they did the story, what they got right and what they got wrong, and try and explain it all.
Yes. So what interested me about these particular stories is that there's a phrase that you mentioned in the book, is that the stories went through what is called the Sunday Times treatment. And I wanted us to talk a little bit about that, because for example, on page 19, I'll just read a little bit from page 19. So you say the story had gone through what insiders called the Sunday Times treatment. So this is on page 19. Undergoing multiple edits to get it into the paper's house style, the draft would go to the news editor, then a sub-editor, then the chief sub would take a look because it was a big story, as would the legal editor, and at least one assistant or deputy editor, and finally, the editor. This is normal newspaper practice, but at the Sunday Times, it was designed to knock the story into a style that was a source of some internal pride. And then on page 20, you then go on to say the culminative result was that the story was clear and firm, hard-hitting. It was a style developed over years and with efficacy proven in the newspaper sales figures. But in the process, allegations often became assertions. Assertions sometimes became facts. Claims became evidence, and evidence became proof. So my question around this is that, is the truth subjective to each publication's style, or are facts the truth, and that's the only thing we should report?
You know, what I described at the Sunday Times, the Sunday Times, more than most newspapers, had developed this approach to how they treated particularly big stories and particularly big investigative stories. And they'd done it over years, and one has to say it was a success in the sense that the newspaper was the biggest selling newspaper in the country. And there were certain sort of principles involved. The story shouldn't be more than 800 words. It should be clear, one narrative, not disputed, no ifs or maybes or buts, in other words, qualifications. And the attitude was, choose the narrative, choose what you believe and go with that. Don't give the reader doubt or maybes or ifs or quotation marks, but give them clarity. And what I challenge is that I think there's something journalistically that's fundamentally wrong with that, because truth is contested, particularly truth when it's processed fast in news. There are different versions, there are different narratives. And the journalist's job is to weigh up those narratives, to verify, to check, and to say to the reader, here it is in a way that isn't simple. It's very seldom simple black and white stories. Our job is to convey the complexity, yes, to make it easily understandable and easy to read and to consume for the reader. But it can't be to oversimplify. It can't be to take one narrative. It has to acknowledge that every story has competing viewpoints and narratives. And I suppose I come from a school that says great journalism accepts that it's not there to produce one unquestionable truth. It's there to guide you to the truth by weighing up and verifying and contextualizing competing versions of a story.
So,
and that's very fundamental to the way one thinks and way one approaches a story. The Sunday Times went one way. I'm saying they've shown us, and I hope I show in the book, that that is the wrong path.
So that's interesting, because also on page 72, there's an interesting passage that you write. You say, some journalists take the view that their role is simply to mirror what's happening in the world, gather all sides of the story, check the facts, and convey them as neutrally as possible, suspending any bias, prejudice, or personal opinion, balancing different viewpoints. These are the techniques taught to beginners as a formula to cope with contested facts and heated narratives under pressure of deadlines. It's the approach loved by most risk-averse media lawyers. Most seasoned journalists, as opposed to just reporters, embrace the choices they have to make and see their job as making those decisions in the best way to convey the stories, nuances, contradictions, and conflicts. Their job is not just to report, but to explain, to take the reader on a narrative journey, to enable the audience not just to know the facts, but to understand, to empathize, to identify, even to care. Does this process then not allow the journalist to impart their opinion about an individual? I mean, if you take the Trump reporting, for example.
Look, you can't get away from the fact that the journalist has to make a huge number of decisions that affect what comes out at the other end. Now, so just to give you an example, we all know if you cover something as simple as a car crash,
yes,
you'll get different views from different people, maybe the different drivers, maybe different people who saw it happen, maybe the policeman who arrives and sees what happens later. You will get different views, and sometimes even different facts or claims. The journalist has to listen to all of those, to verify, to weigh them up, to weigh them. You don't treat them all. If we were just a mirror, you would just say, well, here's the different viewpoints. But that doesn't help anyone. What we have to do is we say, do we give this one more weight than that one? Do we believe this person more than that one? Why should we take the view of this person who saw it above that driver? Is this person got a bias? And hopefully when we make those decisions, and let me tell you that that's a decision about every quote you make, every bit of the quote you choose to use, how you describe people, whether it gives what they say weight or not, what you leave in and put out the story, what headline all of these things are myriad decisions that shape the story. You can't avoid those decisions. If we were just a mirror, then you would just say what happened. But I'm saying that's actually nonsense. We have to make those decisions. Now, what we hope as trained, professional, self-conscious, self-aware journalists, we hope that we strive to make ourselves aware of our own biases and our own prejudices in making those decisions. So I would never say we should pretend that we can be completely objective and that we have no biases and no prejudices. We have to be aware of those. Am I giving more weight to this view rather than that view because it's a man rather than a woman, or because it's a young person, an old person rather than a young person, or a white person rather than a black person? Now, ideally, we make ourselves self-aware enough to try and overcome our prejudices, our biases, our histories, in order to strive constantly to give our audience a story that comes as close to the truth as possible. That's complicated, that's difficult, that's risky, very hard thing to teach.
It's very, yes, it is hard. Because you have to think, well, what do I leave out? What will the reader, because there are always complaints. So, well, why did you leave that fact out? Because there were so many facts, you had to choose so that you can get to the essence of the story, or what is, as you said, closest to the truth as much as possible. So
exactly, and almost every word that you choose to use in your report is a decision to be made. If I choose to say this person is young or old or black or white or a man or a woman or a policeman or a drunkard or has a history of dishonesty or is a respectable, trusted person, each word I use to describe that person is a decision that affects how people read the story.
Yes, that's true. And also, whether people believe the story or not, the way it is written, it's very important. So in a case where a story has been proven to have been reported maybe slightly off track, and the editor or the newspaper then has to retract the story. So for example, so in terms of the two stories that we've mentioned so far, so in 2018, on 14 October 2018, in the book, so this is on page 183, editor Bongani Siqoko, who was the then editor of the Sunday Times, wrote an apology letter retracting the two particular stories. So he says, we got it wrong. And for that, we apologize. That was the headline on 14 October 2018. So he says, the first story was the renditions story. The allegations that senior policemen Anwar Dramat and Shadrach Sibiya had been involved in illegally handing over criminals to Zimbabwe, some of whom had been tortured and killed. This story had brought down the two respected officers. The second story was the story of the Hawks, Cato Manor Death Squad. This story had ended the 40-year career of another respected officer, Johan Boysen. So clearly, these were big stories that had far-reaching consequences. So when the editor retracts, how much pressure is on the editor to say the right words in order to retract the story and perhaps even make amends to the people that were implicated? How much pressure is on the editor to do that?
Look, when Bongani took over as editor of the Sunday Times, he was brought in to clean it up and replace the person who'd been editor through not all, but most of these stories. And so he was under, in fact, enormous pressure to, as quickly as he could, deal with this problem and get rid of it, because it was dragging down the newspaper and its newsroom. So he did it. He chose to do it by apologizing, retracting, saying they'd been misled and they'd been played, and then dealing with the individual journalists, and then giving some space to the people you mentioned, General Boysen, Anwar Dramat, and others who'd been affected by the story, giving them space in the paper to put their case, which they hadn't been able to do over the full 5 years of the story. I think what I try also point to in the book is that I think they needed to do more. So I think it's very good to apologize unreservedly. It's very good to give space to those who've been damaged. You can't undo the damage you've done. So that's a complete tragedy. But I thought the newspaper needed to do much more to find out what was it about their newsroom that allowed this to happen. I don't know if you know the famous story in the New York Times, which is one of the world's great newspapers, when they found they'd been misled by one of their most well-known reporters for a number of years. He'd been making up stories.
Mm.
They did a huge investigation and published it all. And I think that it's best to do that. Mm. It's best to spell out to your readers fully and clearly why you went wrong and what you're doing to make sure. It's not you have to say we're taking steps to make sure it never happens. You have to be explicit about it. And I think the Sunday Times should have been more explicit about it, because it's not the first time the Sunday Times got into this kind of trouble. So really that was telling them something. I think, you see, I think one of the great lessons of modern journalism and of this experience is that you have to be completely transparent. We have to develop a new style of journalism with a kind of radical transparency in explaining how we do things, what we can do, what we can't do, where we go wrong when we go wrong.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
On that note, in the book, the first part is titled Fast Journalism, and the second part is titled Slow Journalism. So can a journalist who works for a newspaper that doesn't have as much time to do a lot of checks and balances, time is tricky, time is money. So can they also apply the same methods that a publication that maybe would fall under slow journalism? There's a time difference. Can they function similarly in terms of fact checking?
It's a very good question. And no, clearly a daily newspaper has only a few hours to check things. A weekly newspaper perhaps has a few days. A monthly magazine might have a few weeks. And what's happened with social and digital media is that they're competing in a news cycle that just gets faster and faster. And so that pressure is not going to go away. We can't all pretend we have all the time in the world. The pressure of deadlines is always going to be there. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not worth compromising your integrity and the trust of readers by rushing things too much. Take a breath, slow down. It's not worth publishing until you have verified and are confident of the story. And then you have to publish in a way that says, we think this, and we believe this, and we've taken the following steps to verify it. But if we get it wrong, we have to be prepared as quickly to apologize, to give different viewpoints, and to admit where we get it wrong. And one of the key things here is that the Sunday Times, when they got it wrong, they dug their heels in.
Yes.
And it took them sometimes 5 years to retract and apologize for stories that were clearly wrong.
Yes, and also I wanted to ask about if a story is written about me. And so in the book, you mentioned that there is a requirement that the journalist or the publication has to give the subject of the story time to respond or time to check if whatever has been written about them is factual. And in the book, you say sometimes some publications do this at the very last, like they give the subject matter maybe even an hour and a half or even less than that to formulate a response or to fact check. Should that time be expanded? Should it be mandatory that you must give the subject matter at least one day before you publish about them?
So the codes of conduct generally talk about giving reasonable time for a right of reply.
Mm.
Now, if you're a journalist who cares about getting it right, you know that the more you talk to the subject of your story, the more you give them the right of reply, the more accurate you should be in the end. The Sunday Times had developed the habit, and the habit of going to their source as late as possible.
Mm.
And this is a habit that had developed because many times when you went to the people to discuss the story, they then either changed their story or they tried to do something to stop you publishing, either in the courts or by phoning your boss or in some way threatening you.
Mm.
So to avoid that, they developed the practice of going as late as possible. And it's a bad practice. There's no question. It's a bad practice, and it leads you on this path of getting things wrong. I don't think you can put an hour, one day. You know, sometimes your right of reply involves checking one fact. And if that's the case, then half an hour can be reasonable. So it really depends on, but other stuff, it would only be reasonable to give people a few days because it's a long and complicated and difficult story. And you've got to give them time to produce evidence that shows you your story may be wrong. Mm. So there's no strict rule. It's a question of judging each time what is reasonable. But certainly an hour or two is very, very seldom enough, to be fair.
Yes, absolutely.
And these are decisions the editor has to make to be fair, to be reasonable, and to help their striving to get the story right.
Yes, in fact, in the story with Johan Boysen, so Hofstadter and Wa Afrika actually had a meeting with Johan Boysen before the story was published. And then they gave him a little bit of time for the right of reply. So in fact, in the book, on page 15, so the conversation between Boysen and Hofstadter, Boysen is saying, Boysen asked Hofstadter if he thought it was fair to spend many days investigating the claims and then take just 90 minutes, a few days before publication to hear the other side. And then Hofstadter says, I think it is fair. Some other journalists would give you much less time. So, and then obviously the story eventually was retracted. So it's very interesting. Does the journalist take blame for the story being retracted, or does that all fall under the editor?
No, look, a journalist, to get it wrong, has to take responsibility for their story.
Yes.
An editor always takes final responsibility because the editor's job is to guide the journalist, to check the copy, to make sure that all the checks and balances and verification is in place. So the editor does take ultimate responsibility, but the journalist, every person has to take responsibility for what they do and the decisions they make. One of the things that went wrong at the Sunday Times was that you would have a team working on the story. And so they would get, maybe there were 5 or 6 names in the byline that said who wrote the story. And because the policy at the Sunday Times was anyone who said anything, had anything to do with the story, got their name in it. So it meant that if you gave one fact and hadn't even seen the rest of the story, your name was there. And therefore you had to account for the story. And it creates a situation where each person can say, that part of the story was wrong, but I didn't do that story. And then everyone is pointing to everyone else about who's responsible for the story. In the end, the editor has to take responsibility and work out who is responsible for what decision. So it's not a straightforward thing. It's complicated, but being accountable at every stage, every person in that chain has to be accountable for the decisions they make and transparent about that accountability. That's what we learned from this experience.
Has the Sunday Times revamped their image? Are they better now, would you say?
Look, they've got an editor now has been working very hard to improve the image, to put these things behind him, and I think he's doing it strongly and in good faith. I think it's just for people to judge how they view the paper, if they think it's recovered. I would hope it can rehabilitate itself, because, you know, we have so many difficulties, other difficulties in our media. And the situation of traditional media and newspapers in particular, like the Sunday Times, is so difficult and precarious now, that we really hope that they can strengthen their journalism and get themselves back on a solid footing.
All right, Anton, another story that you touch on in the book is the story involving Johan van Logenberg. And this is the case that involved SARS and the tobacco industry businesses who were dodging tax payments. And then these businesses seem to have government connections. So on page 99, you mentioned that in the Sunday Times first story, Johan van Logenberg was described as a former apartheid undercover police agent. And you say it's one of the most damning things to say about a South African, short only of calling someone a murderer, a rapist, or a pedophile. Like all those epithets, it leads to immediate isolation and condemnation. And Johan was, so he took issue with how he was labeled in the story. And then it turned out, and then there was a trail of, well, who might have written this line in the story. And then eventually it turns out that it was the editor-in-chief. Well, she says, so in the book, on page 100, you say, a number of people told me it had been inserted by the editor-in-chief, Felicia Opelt. And 2 told me that she had admitted privately to it. Another staff member said he traced the versions of the story through the Sunday Times computer system and that the edition had been made when it was in Opelt's hands. To me, though, she said, perhaps I did. Perhaps I did. I don't remember. So my question is, how much power does the editor-in-chief of a publication have? Does she or he have carte blanche to do whatever she wants? I mean, there's a movie, I don't know if you remember this movie, there's a movie called The Devil Wears Prada. And in the book, in the movie, it's based on a book, but in the movie, the editor-in-chief, Miranda Priestley, played by, I can't remember her name now. So she walks in the building and everyone is terrified of her. Meryl Streep, she was played by Meryl Streep. So she has carte blanche of everything that happens in that building. Is that the real case in the life of an editor-in-chief?
No, it's not. The editor has a lot of power, but interestingly, not as much power as I think editors used to have. I think that 20, 30 years ago, the editor of the Sunday Times had enormous power to change stuff, to withhold stuff, to do different stuff. But I think it's now much more transparent and much more accountable, largely because of social media. It's much easier to challenge an editor's power and authority because of social media. So I think those things have changed and editors are less powerful. We also have many more media outlets now because the media, there's so much more media now. It used to be the Sunday Times was like the king of newspapers, an overpowering voice that set the national agenda, the national news agenda, or had a huge influence on the national news agenda. That falls away in the era of multiple diverse digitals and social media. So editors are less powerful. Certainly the one thing an editor should always be careful of doing is the editor is perfectly entitled to change a reporter's copy, but not to do it in a way that introduces inaccuracies. And one of the problems at the Sunday Times was that multiple editors in that process you described earlier that it went through would make changes that would introduce errors. And that, quite frankly, is bad editing. yes, you have to make changes, but they should all be checked and verified with the writer and the researcher and the reporter to make absolutely sure you're not introducing mistakes. And many of the mistakes in the Sun Times were introduced by editors trying to sharpen up the story. One of the difficulties here that I try and show is that Felicia Oppelt, the editor, had, in a sense, a personal link to the story. And I think that was part of the issue, in that it colored her view. She denies it strongly, let me hasten to say. But her ex-husband was a person who'd worked with and hated van Lochrenberg. So there's a big question about who the source of this claim that he was an apartheid spy was. And I think the evidence points to the fact that her view was colored by her ex-husband's complete dislike, obsessive dislike for van Lochrenberg. And that's an unfortunate, when an editor lets their personal relations and prejudices like that to come into the editorial decisions, it's a recipe for making mistakes. Yes, and there's another link to a personal attack, maybe. So when you went to interview Shadrach Sibiya in his office, so you say this in the book, and then you ask him, why do you think Africa targeted him, or why do you think he was a target of Africa? And then he says to you that at some point when Africa was arrested, Sibiya happened to be there in that scene, and then it was from that moment on that Africa disliked him or began to target him. Does that often happen, that maybe the source or maybe the subject matter is someone disliked by the journalist, and so they might use that as a dig at that person? Look, I said earlier that journalists, we have to make ourselves self-aware of our prejudices, our likes and dislikes. And so, a good professional journalism would mean put aside my personal dislikes, put aside the fact that that this guy once arrested me, and judge the story and the facts on their merits. It's hard to do. It's hard for any of us to do, but professionalism, like for judges, you have to do what you can to be self-aware enough to do the best you can to overcome your prejudices and biases and histories, and certainly your personal dislikes of someone. You need to be very careful of letting that override good decision making. Yes. And as I read this book, at some points it felt like a lesson in journalism. So I think both people who are starting out in journalism and people who have been in the industry for a long time will benefit from a lot of what you say here. But also you were critiquing in this book your colleagues in the industry. And so my question is, what has been the response from some of your colleagues when it comes to this kind of critiquing the ins and outs of the industry? I mean, on page 17, you say, Africa wouldn't and still won't speak to me. So what has been the response from your colleagues? Look, from some of those I wrote about in the book, they won't speak to me. So my relationships with them are not so good. But I must say, from the overwhelming majority of my colleagues, I've had interest and support and positive remarks. And a few of them have said, this is a book that should be read by every journalist and every journalism students. I'd like to see it as wider, that I think as important to me is that every consumer of news, in other words, every citizen, I would hope would read it to get a better understanding of what we do as journalists. Because I think one of the reasons we find such criticism and distrust of journalists is because people don't really understand much of what we do. And so my hope is that the book helps everyone understand better. As I say, both how incredibly important journalism is, and how incredibly difficult and risky and vulnerable it is as well.
At the beginning of part 2, Anton, of the book, so the part 2 is titled Slow Journalism. And there's a chapter that you've titled A Remarkable Find. And so this is the chapter that then begins to tell us about the Gupta emails and how they were discovered. And so that's a very interesting part of the book. You introduce us to John and Stan. So John and Stan are not their real names, but they are fake names of the two men who originally found or discovered the hard drive that had the Gupta emails. And then when the men were looking for a way to publicize these emails, they eventually connected to Brian Curran. And then in part of the conversations, Stan mentions payment. And on page 126, for example, I'll just read a little bit of what you say in terms of the conversation. So Stan and John, so this is on page 26, Stan and John wanted to get enough compensation for the material to enable them to be safe and secure. They were risking their own and their families' lives and businesses, and they needed to look after themselves. And they wanted help to get the material into the right hands to ensure that the corrupt were held to account. Anton, can a source be paid? And who is allowed to pay the source for their information?
I think any journalist knows that once you start paying a source, you're in danger of discrediting the source and, in a sense, encouraging them or others to believe that they might exaggerate the story in order to get more money. So you have to be incredibly careful about payment to sources, and many journalism institutions would forbid any payment to journalists. But, it was absolutely legitimate to ask for money to protect themselves and to make sure they and their families were safe. And they had decided, I think quite rightly, that the best way to do that would be to get out the country for a lengthy period of time. And that's an expensive thing to do, to uproot yourself and go to a country where you can't work, you can't earn, and you need to be there for at least a couple of years. So what I'm saying is that there's a difficult and gray area often between refusing to pay but paying for costs such as security. And in this case, I think that money came to help them get out the country and to try and minimize the damage the whole story did to their personal lives and their professional lives. But it's a fine line, and they are adamant that they certainly didn't do it for the money. They did it because the story needed to come out. And all they did was ensure their safety and security. And I think we can see it's very important. I mean, the people who often suffer the most in these stories are people like them, brave whistleblowers who helped the story get out. And their lives are often the most affected by this. And it's a problem. We need to give better support, financial, moral, legal, to whistleblowers who take a stand and help expose this kind of information.
Yes. But also what I wanted to understand is that because even in the book, you call them John and Stan, so no one knows their real names. Were they under threat? Were they scared? How would Zuma and the Guptas know who they were if they remained anonymous?
Well, obviously there was a fear that particularly since Zuma and the Guptas seem to have a hold and huge influence in intelligence services, that they might be exposed, that in a phone call or a private discussion or by following people or by tracking people on their cell phones, that they might learn who these men were. And yes, my view is that at least in the beginning, while those involved in state capture still had the tools of the state or influence over the tools of the state, yes, I think their lives were potentially in danger, because you're talking about some people who would have taken any measures to stop the story coming out. So I think they absolutely were right to need to be extremely careful, and to be aware that their lives could be in danger.
Yes. And then does the life of the whistleblower ever go back to normal? Because in fact, at the very beginning of the book, you dedicate this book to the whistleblowers. Does the life of the whistleblower ever go back to normal? And I'm asking this because on page 118, so there's an interesting passage or an interesting reflection that Brian Curran has about Stan in particular. So he says, Stan wrote to Curran. So on page 180, Stan wrote to Curran in 2018 to ask for the original of his and John's signed affidavits. Also, key elements in the evidence chain that linked the hard drive to the Guptas. Curran declined. The affidavits didn't belong to Stan or John, he explained, and he needed to keep the originals. Curran told me he was saddened that his relationship with Stan had soured, though he could understand the reasons for it. He says, as much as I admire what he did and appreciate the impact it had on his and his wife's lives, I found him a difficult person to work with. This left Curran with some tough dilemmas. At some stage, I had to choose between trying to please him on the one hand and achieving the objectives of what I regarded as our joint project. I chose the latter and have no regrets that I did that. And then you carry on saying, this, sadly, is not an unusual outcome for whistleblowers. Their lives torn apart. They enjoy a brief period of pride and satisfaction and then are left to stand alone and rebuild their lives when the story moves on. They watch others being honored for their work and they stay in the background. Does the life of the whistleblower ever get back to normal?
Very seldom, very seldom, particularly in such a complicated and difficult and risky case as this one. So that is a very sad reality. I certainly argue and did argue to them that I thought they should come out, and they would best protect themselves now by coming out in public and being free about what they did. They didn't. They've preferred to stay quiet. Hopefully, at some stage, they feel that it's fine to get the public recognition they deserve.
Yes.
So I think it's something we really need to address as a society, to try and ensure ways, as I say, legal, moral, political, financial support for whistleblowers to enable them to do it and keep or get their lives back on track. There just isn't enough support in our society at the moment to enable it, but it is something we should definitely be addressing.
And then lastly, Anton, in closing, we did mention that media is changing. Everything, not just because of COVID, but because of how technology is advancing. So now I get a lot of news via my cell phone or via some internet subscription that I have. A lot of newspapers have online publications and you have to subscribe to this. So as the landscape changes, as it evolves, do you think this is positive for media capture to protect journalists and publications from media capture? Or do you think, do you have positive feelings about the future of media and journalism and physical publications versus online publications?
Well, let me put it this way. I think we have been and will still for a while be in a very difficult period for news media because there's so much changing. We're having to adapt, and financially, this has put a huge strain on the work we do as journalists. So I think we're in for a tough time. There are positive aspects in that social media gives voice to many people who didn't have voice before. It makes it much harder to suppress or manipulate a story, but it also gives huge tools to those who want to spread disinformation. So it's also undermined a lot of trust in media and in news and in truth. And we have to rebuild that step by step by asserting truth over untruth, facts over disinformation. So we're caught in a global cultural battle between disinformation, malicious disinformation often, and the search for truth and facts. And we have to step by step assert the power, importance, value of truth and facts, or the search for truth and facts, to counter the many malicious attempts to use disinformation to undermine our economy, our democracy, our society, and to cause harm and to cause conflict. You know, we've seen this very clearly demonstrated just in the last few days in America, how disinformation and lies and malicious manipulation can lead almost to civil war and to sedition and to insurrection and to terrible, deep social conflict. We have to be very aware of what we need to do to counter that and to reestablish trust, unity, faith in facts and truth.
Yes. Wow. It'll be a tough journey. It'll be a fight because so many people have access to the internet and they want to become famous. So many people want to become known. And so they'll take anything as long as it's controversial so that they can put themselves out there. So I think it'll be a very tricky fight for journalism. But I'm very hopeful.
I'm hoping in the long run as well, because the internet has also given us fantastic tools.
Yes.
For research, for verification, for double checking, etc. So there's a lot of work to be done, but in the long run, I'm also optimistic in the long run.
Wow. Anton Harber, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. So for the record by Anton Harber. Thank you everyone for joining us.